Welcome everybody again to our panel discussion. We're really excited about the topic tonight. Pretty different again from what we've done so far, which is kind of great. Every week we get to remind ourselves what the topic is and go, oh yeah, this is going to be so cool. And then of course, it always is really interesting. So Colin, have you got control there? Okay, so here, whoever was going to do that announcement, it's on all yours.
Right. So I just wanted to make a quick announcement about the final essay. We've been receiving some fantastic topics from you folks, so we're really looking forward to reading them. We've also been receiving some interesting ideas about other types of submissions that you could do, other creations that you could write about, things like infographics or podcasts. And we do want to support your creativity for sure. We also have to assess everybody on the same level. And so if you have another type of medium that you work in with your field that you want to submit for your final assignment, then please let us know and we'll chat about it. We would also ask you to write something though. We need to look in depth at critical analysis and whatnot and be able to assess people on the same level. So we would want you to write a 1,500 word, basically mini essay. The standard research essay that we're asking for is 2,500 words, or 2,000 to 2,500 words. So shorter with your additional creation, and hopefully that will both satisfy your creativity and allow us to be able to assess you on the same, everybody on the same level. And so I'll post something in the next day or so that will formalize that, but we've just been chatting about it today with the teaching team, and we think it should be really positive. It should really hopefully help engage you with the course material. And so I think that's what I have.
Okay, and we will, we're planning to have tonight one of the 3 possible questions for a short-term assignment, to have something that's more creative for one of the options. So we'll test it out. And Colin, I think we wanted to also mention that for the last week of the semester, we are looking for students' input on who we should invite as a guest for a final week. So we're hoping that this is something that will be discussed in the seminars this week, and we'll get some feedback back, because we'd like to start sending invitations possibly next week or early the week after. And just as usual, so we'll start with the presentations, and then everyone feel free to come in as much as you want in the chat with questions, and Ryan and I will try to pick some of them, summarize some of them, and just keep up with the chat. So just as usual. And I'll let next slide, Ryan, go on this.
So this is actually more of a follow-up to last week's discussion on community and so on, and a lot of discussion we had about equity, diversity, inclusion as a key approach to dealing with the pandemic. And I thought I would point out that the Public Health Agency has put out their report from the Chief Medical Officer, and it came out, I think, within the last couple of days, and it's called From Risk to Resilience, an Equity Approach to COVID-19. So seemed like a very nice follow-up to what we had talked about last week. I've just put the link to the document in the chat if you're interested in it. You can download the report. And hopefully some of the themes that we've been discussing throughout the semester will be clear within this document. So anyway, an interesting follow-up. Again, just kind of highlighting the real-world relevance, I suppose, of the topics and accidentally the timing of those panel discussions. Okay, so tonight we're talking about technology and COVID-19, and we've got a really exciting lineup of panelists for you tonight, coming from 3 different units across campus. And so what we'll do, as usual, is we'll introduce them each before their introductory presentation, and then we will have questions that you can type into the chat, and the panelists will respond to those throughout the rest of the evening. So we'll start off tonight with Dr. Rozita Dara, who is an associate professor in the School of Computer Science and the principal investigator of the Data Management and Privacy Governance Research Program. Her research group focuses on advancing the next generation of the Internet of Things platforms using artificial intelligence with a particular focus on information privacy governance. Dr. Dara's group works closely with several private, international, and government organizations on projects related to building distributed and cooperative artificial intelligence algorithms to protect data and ethical intelligent machines to ensure information privacy and fairness. So a lot of directly relevant things that we've been talking about in terms of tracking and contact tracing and so on. So Rozita, we're very pleased to have you here tonight.
Okay, thank you very much. Thanks, Ryan, and thank you for having me. My name is Rozita Dara, as Ryan indicated. I'm a faculty member at the School of Computer Science. My research is in the area of artificial intelligence and information privacy. So today I want to briefly talk about what changes technologies are bringing to our society. I'll briefly go over some of the technologies and their underlying kind of functionality and how it's changing our world. I will briefly talk about privacy. I know it's a very interesting topic. I'll leave it for the QA more than talking about details here. So as you have experienced so far, technology is playing a crucial role during the pandemic. So it has changed our life from the way we used to buy stuff, used to eat, I would say, socialize, and also how we used to work. So some of the technologies probably you may find interesting or exciting. Obviously, being social virtually through games, that has increased significantly. I think most of you may agree with me. Because we had to change our kind of traditional social lifestyle. So education have become majority online. 1.5 billion kids have been impacted. So many of them are used to stay home. Now it has changed in some of the countries. So many technologies that are, for example, AI-enabled teachers, virtual reality in those kind of developed countries are using these technologies. And in other countries, if they have access to some digital technology, they use those technology. Unfortunately, because of COVID, digital divide issue has become a significant issue. And also working from home. So again, the rise of technologies such as cloud, artificial intelligence, facial recognition, all of those have increased, but all security technologies. So all of those together have enabled us to stay from home, work, be paid, and stay safe. And many businesses have stayed open because of these technologies. But again, underlying many of these technologies is massive data collection, personal data collection. Some of this technology even track eyes or the facial recognition to read our expression, which sites we visit, and those kind of things. Telehealth in many countries, government is encouraging the use of telehealth to just, again, keep people safe and also reduce social interaction, and also the increasing use of chatbots, where patients can speak with robots and then get diagnosed, express their symptoms and also get recommendation on what the next step is. Again, this type of technologies, there is a massive data collection. They collect your voice, process it to be able to answer, help the patients. So online entertainment, as I mentioned, we have become creative. There are many ways that we are entertaining ourselves, including, ways that we can, just sit at home and start watching, for example, Venice or some part of the world live, which is, I have just recently kind of discovered that, and I'm enjoying sometimes working and watching different locations and what's in real time. So online shopping, I assume this is something, a major change for most of us. I was hesitant to order many things through Amazon, but it has become a common practice. So Amazon and many other similar platform-based firms, they have grown up. I think Amazon net profit has increased twice. I mean, it's twice as it used to be. It has doubled. So online shopping, again, it's very comfortable. We are sitting at home when we are ordering things, and we can easily, for free, even ship it back if we don't like it. And many other, contactless delivery and many other technologies. And supply chain for food and all of that has also changed, so because of the technology. So technology has provided us an opportunity again to stay home, stay safe, and also be productive, basically. But some of the negative or some other side effect, increasing digital divide, massive data collection, and also automation. Either it has increased already or it will, because it is a recognition that we need that kind of technology. So one more question that I want to briefly bring up, and I think it comes to our mind, is do we go back to normal? When we will go back to normal? So normal is a definition that depends on the person. It may, very much dependent on the person. If it is health and financial, kind of security, most likely we will go back when it's, we don't know, but probably when there will be a vaccine that is effective. Is it social interactions, handshaking and all of that? Most likely we will go back. But because of the technology and our recognition of how effective technology can make, for example, many of the companies in terms of their net profit, working from home, they don't have to, they are saving a lot that way by keeping many of their employees at home. And because of that, again, there will be massive technologies that collect data and, to make themselves productive and measure effectiveness of their employees and, their efficiency. So that's one component that is not going to go away, after pandemic. So work from home, so some of the traditional boundaries, geography of the job, of kind of landscape of job may change because of automation. Many of the kind of job landscape may change, go toward people who have kind of digital skills, more advanced digital skills. Some jobs may disappear. So experts were predicting that, but they were expecting that this way will be coming so quickly. And the rise of Microsoft firms, such as, platform firms such as, Alibaba in China, Amazon, Microsoft, data collection, automating everything, use of IoT, the Internet of Things for data collection. So we can only see increase in use of those technologies, and the underlying kind of foundation of those technologies, which is data collection and artificial intelligence. And why is it important? Well, obviously, it's completely changing the landscape in terms of how we interact, how we work, what sort of skills we should have. And also one of the foundational concepts of democracy, which is privacy, that also needs to be looked very carefully. So the use of technology, many experts believe that would kind of change the core aspect of, democracy, which is and privacy is one of the foundational kind of a pillar of democracy. So with massive data collection, we are kind of making ourselves vulnerable to massive surveillance, or some people call surveillance state. Who has our data, how it's being used, how it's being governed. So those are very important questions. We are lucky we live in Canada, but in some other parts of the world, kind of platforms such as the ones that exist in China, and pretty sure many other countries are implementing very similar technologies. Social credit system where citizens' data gets collected, and based on that, they get rewarded based on their action. So all of those will constantly increase, and governments will know that they have more and more power. So it's a time for us to negotiate with our government as we are going through this path, through this journey to become more for adopting technology more and more. It's important for government to start looking at new policies, investment in, human aspect and our skills in terms of having the right skills, and also internet connection, and also putting policies and laws that would protect us and protect our privacy. And, so these are the things that our government needs to look at. It's for us to constantly ask questions about ethical and kind of fair technologies, and start thinking about how we can embed those into the technology, and also train our kind of to ensure that developers, technocrats, they have the right knowledge and skills of new policies and the right ways to develop technologies so that the technology is fair and it's transparent. We have to think about who would be accountable and all those factors that impact our life with the advancement in the technology. So this is something I wanted to talk about, and I'm going to stop here, and thank you very much.
Thank you so much. I'm just thinking of all kinds of different things based on what you were talking about. But we'll have to save some of that for the conclusion of the presentation. So we'll move on to the next panelist. Dr. Eric Nost is an assistant professor in the Department of Geography, Environment, and Geomatics. He researches how data and digital technologies inform environmental governance. His work often uses mapping to publicize the uneven results of policy, and he's developed web-based methods for assessing how governance actors frame environmental problems. He addresses digital governance within a variety of topical issues, including conservation, environmental injustice, and climate change adaptation. Eric, it's great to have you with us tonight.
Well, thank you all so much for inviting me, and I'm really happy to and excited to engage in this conversation. So first, I just want to say I'm really glad to see some faces and names in the audience tonight. Some of what I'm about to say will be very familiar to the Geography 2480 crowd. That's mapping in GIS. So bear with me, you've heard it before, or a lot of it at least. For those of you in Geography 1220, Human Impact on the Environment, you might get to see another side of the work that I do in the research that I'm interested in. I really appreciate Rozita's thoughts, wonderful kind of broad overview of the many different ways in which technology is shaping our response to the pandemic and how it might change society going forward. I'm going to sort of drill in to focus on one particular kind of technology, at least in these opening statements, which is that of mapping. Before I get there, I think one of the broad prompts that I was given was, how does your discipline, how does your, field see or understand the pandemic? And so I'm going to say a little bit about geography. Geographers are quite a diverse bunch of researchers. As some of my colleagues recently put it, it's a sprawling, ragged, with a whole heaps of different ways we map, we model, critique, expose, drill, dig, survey, measure, talk, hang out with, theorize, analyze, deconstruct. We do lots of different things. And in fact, you've already heard from one geographer in this course, or you were supposed to, Evan Fraser. And I assume he came and talked about the resilience of our food systems, or lack thereof, during the pandemic. So geographer, I'm also a geographer. I'm going to probably talk a little bit about somewhat different things than him. Nevertheless, at the core of geography is integrating environmental and social change in place and across space. So geographers ask questions like, what effect will COVID have on our food system here in Guelph, given that we import so much food from around the world and export it at the same time? Why is there a higher rate of COVID in the US than in Canada, in Quebec than Ontario, in the western edge of Toronto than in downtown neighborhoods? These are the kinds of questions that geographers ask about the pandemic. And I'm not the kind of geographer who answers those questions directly. I'm not a health geographer, I want to make that clear, but I do make maps. And when you think of geography, you probably think of, memorizing capitals, country names, maps. They're super important to how we understand the disease, COVID. I'm sure you've all seen a COVID map before. Maybe in order to gauge how COVID was affecting your community versus other communities. Maps also inform decision makers about where outbreaks are taking place. Think about it this way. What would be easier to understand, a spreadsheet full of numbers about caseloads in each public health district, or a map that makes that information visual? Well, probably, or at least hopefully, it's the map that kind of tells that story in a much more straightforward way. And we've been making maps, geographers have been making maps of disease since we first learned how disease is an even spread. And so I'm actually going to share my screen and show you some of those maps. So this is a map created by Dr. John Snow in 1854 during an outbreak of cholera in London, England. Okay, and he was one of the first to kind of do this kind of mapping of disease. And he mapped out where all the water wells were in this neighborhood, as well as all the homes of people who had been diagnosed with cholera. And he found that most of those people with cholera kind of clustered around that one well. And so he said, hey, there must be something going on with that one particular well. And then that mapping enabled him to associate cases with that one well and to say, hey, maybe that's the cause here. Today, we use sophisticated digital technologies to make, and data infrastructures to make maps like this. That makes our maps potentially, more accessible to more people, especially when we use code to create them on websites. That doesn't necessarily mean that these maps are more accurate. If the map you saw about COVID was done well, it hopefully gave you the right understanding of the pandemic, but not all maps are equal. So if we go to this map, okay, the 2480 folks have seen this. And it's very likely that you have seen this map before as well. This is the map from the Johns Hopkins University dashboard. It was one of the first big maps of the pandemic early on. It still is very an important way of assessing the spread of the disease globally. What do you think of it? What does this map suggest to you? Just take a second and process that, answer those questions. What does this map suggest about the disease in North America? Well, to me, it suggests that COVID is rampant in the US and nearly non-existent in Canada. And some have even pointed this map to say, well, this is why we need to keep the border closed. And while we are doing better in Canada, relatively, this map is actually fairly misleading. So if we zoom in here, that might be a little bit clearer. So there's two problems with this map. One, in the US, we're taking data at the county level, right? We're showing the disease as it has been assessed at the county level. In Canada, they're showing it at the whole province level, okay? Such that it looks on this map like there's nothing going on in Toronto, we're all okay, nothing in London, nothing in Hamilton, so on and so forth, okay? That's the other problem with this map, is that they put the dot way up in the south province, which is in Ontario, big province, where most people live. And so geographers want to responsibly map the pandemic, and we're interested in data infrastructures. So how is COVID data collected? By whom? What's in the data? Who has access to it? This is getting to, excuse me. This is getting to some of the questions that Rozita raised around democracy and technology in the pandemic. Who has access to this data? Is it widely public? Should police get access? These are, all these questions may seem simple, but it's not. And some of them might seem unimportant, but they really are. If we want to show, that is, map an accurate picture of the pandemic and to compare places, we need to know how the data was collected. Are we counting antibody testing? Are we, double counting? Like, what are we actually measuring? Do we collect demographic information like race so that we can tell whether certain communities are being adequately served? Would reporting that information lead to stigmatization? There's all these sorts of questions that come up, and that I'm really, curious to engage with you all on, but that my training as a geographer lead me to think about. And with that, I'm going to pass the torch.
Thank you. That really interesting. Again, a bunch of questions kind of come to mind already. So we'll certainly welcome those in the chat. But I've started jotting down notes from these talks as well, just stimulating some questions on my part. So our third panelist tonight is Dr. Gus Skorburg, and he's an assistant professor in the Department of Philosophy. And his work covers a wide range of topics in applied ethics, such as bioethics, AI ethics, neuroethics, and business ethics, and moral psychology, including virtue theory, philosophy of cognitive science, and experimental philosophy. Much of his research has explored the philosophical implications of our interdependence with other agents and with information technology. And he was recently named the co-academic director of the Center for Advancing Ethical and Responsible Artificial Intelligence, or CARE AI, here at the University of Guelph. Gus, take it away.
Cool, thanks. I don't know if I speak for Eric here, but I should, mention that I am American, and I totally welcome this discussion as a productive and enjoyable and not at all anxiety-inducing experience on this night. So thanks to all of you, and thanks for the invitation. So what I want to do is kind of similar to maybe what Eric did, just kind of drill down on one example. And so what I want to do is consider one example about the kinds of health apps that are implemented on smartphones often. And I want to use that as kind of a case study. And so I'll take a deep dive on many of the mental health apps that are being sort of proposed as various kinds of solutions to the mental health fallout from the pandemic. And the idea will be to use that as a test case to see how well the example and the ethical issues that I want to raise about it can generalize to other uses of technology, many of which Rozita mentioned, that have been sort of increasingly used as responses to the pandemic. So I think Rozita sort of gave a nice overview, and all I want to sort of add to maybe her remarks is that it's just increasingly obvious what a big role technology, and especially technology driven by artificial intelligence and machine learning, is playing specifically in the response to the COVID disease. So just today, I found an article about chatbots being used at the University of Pennsylvania Hospital to facilitate triage. So you can text in, and then they'll sort of get your place in line when you arrive at the clinic. Duke is using artificial intelligence to identify patients in the hospital at high risk for sepsis. University of California, San Diego is using machine learning to do kind of advanced imaging techniques on lung scans to predict COVID severity. And so it's really hard to overstate the role that these technologies are playing in response to the disease specifically. Now, as I mentioned, I want to focus though on this mental health fallout, right? So as everyone's probably all too aware by now, there are tons of knock-on effects of social distancing, including, of course, insecurity about one's job and one's finances, decreased community support, and often increases in things like substance abuse. And all of these things, we've known for a long time are important predictors of mental illness. And so even before the pandemic started, there was lots of hype in various literatures about the potential of various digital technologies, many of them implemented on smartphones, to address what was widely perceived to be a shortage of mental health clinicians relative to the demand. So some estimates show that worldwide, only about 25% of people receive the care that they need for mental health issues. So even before COVID, this was a large issue. And then, of course, when the pandemic arrived, it just sort of blew this out of the water in a way. And in response, this sort of startup culture around digital mental health apps has enjoyed record levels of funding. So according to one estimate that I read by Rock Health, $5.4 billion in venture investment in just the first 6 months of 2020 into various digital health initiatives. So this is a huge area, only growing faster. So I've mentioned this phrase, digital mental health a few times. And I just want to give you a snapshot of what I mean by this. So I've just got this list that I'll read off. And so these are just examples that I've collected from, reading published papers, hundreds and, probably even thousands of these papers. And so, proponents of digital approaches to health imagine a sort of health ecosystem where the sensors on your smartwatch can reveal really tiny fluctuations in your heart rate variability that are associated with stress. Metadata associated with the tapping and scrolling and typing patterns on your smartphone can indicate symptoms of anxiety. Your fitness tracker will identify movement patterns associated with depression. Automated speech analysis on phone calls can identify symptoms of cognitive impairment or cognitive decline in people with Alzheimer's, for example. Chatbots powered by AI can provide emotional support for hard to reach populations, and Rozita kind of hinted at this. One of my favorite examples is that you can find a lot of papers now touting the power of smart toilets to automatically analyze stool samples to detect the presence of various gut microbes that could be associated, for example, with autism. Smart mattresses, which assess sleep quality for patients with borderline personality disorder, smart pill boxes, which can monitor adherence with psychotic medications, and indeed even smart pills themselves. And so these are just a few examples of sort of what's going on in the digital mental health world. And there's lots of ethical questions, some of which Rozita hinted at, that we need to ask when we're thinking about the deployment of these technologies at scale. And so obviously the questions about privacy and informed consent and data ownership are important, and they've received a lot of attention. What I want to call attention to, though, is two kinds of questions that I think are even more primary and fundamental in the digital mental health case that also generalize nicely to thinking about the technological responses to the pandemic more generally. And so the two questions I want to call our attention to are questions of efficacy. Right? Do these technologies work? So in the case I want to consider, does the use of smartphone apps for mental health purposes demonstrably improve mental health outcomes? Right? Do they work? And second, I want to consider or highlight the importance of questions about justice. Is the widespread use of these technologies going to be likely to exacerbate the kind of inequalities that have been laid bare by the pandemic, which I assume have been discussed in the context of this class? So first, I want to start with the question of efficacy. And the first thing to say is that the overwhelming majority of digital health applications are not evidence-based and not supported by sort of peer-reviewed studies. And so the first thing to say is just that you can access, by some estimates, up to 200,000 of these apps in the Google Play and iTunes store. The overwhelming majority of them are not evidence-based. What I want to do is just really quickly review some research that I've done over the summer where I said, okay, even though most aren't, there does exist a small subset of mental health apps that have been assessed rigorously. So what I did is reviewed around 20 different meta-analyses of randomized control trials. So basically the highest quality evidence we have of smartphone apps looking to treat things like anxiety and depression. And so I won't dive into the details here and sort of go into the weeds. But what happens when you sort of dig into this evidence is that at face value, it looks quite good, right? So a lot of these apps are very low cost, and crucially, they're very scalable, right? So smartphones are so ubiquitous, it would be very easy to reach large numbers of people, respect social distancing guidelines. They can be used for sort of triage purposes and kind of stepped up care. And so on the surface, they look quite good. But what I found is that when you sort of really dig into the evidence and see what happens when you really start to look at some of the analyses, what you find is that the treatment conditions, right, the people who actually get an intervention for depression or anxiety on a smartphone, they rarely perform active control conditions. Right, which is to say, when you compare apples to apples and you have, one group of people in a study getting, cognitive behavioral therapy delivered for anxiety, and then you have another group of people that's like an actually matched control where they're, also engaging on their smartphone, they're attending to something on their smartphone. What you find is when you compare these interventions with active control conditions, there's almost never a statistically significant difference between those two conditions. And so one of the phrases that I've taken to use is that for the vast majority of these apps, they're about as effective as listening to music is, right? So like listening to music on your smartphone is an example of a kind of active control condition that's often used in these studies. So, I can go into some of the details if folks are interested, but sort of at least my review of the literature seemed to suggest that the evidence for efficacy is quite limited. Now, what I want to do, though, is just sort of set that aside for a moment. And move to the second question related to justice. And so Rozita mentioned this idea of the digital divide, and I want to drill down on that a little bit. Right? And so what I want to suggest is that even if we set aside all these issues with efficacy and assume that, with all this, venture capital being invested, we're going to develop these like amazing smartphone apps that actually can, help people with depression or anxiety. I want to suggest that even in that like fantastical world where that's true, even the best evidence-based forms of digital mental health run the risk of locking in a vicious cycle of digital inequality. right? And so the way that this cycle goes is familiar to people who have studied the digital divide, right? Those with fewer digital resources, so access to smartphone or reliable internet, those with lower digital literacy, those people who, don't know how to use the technologies or aren't motivated to learn, they become excluded from advances in this technology. And so that in turn makes it less likely that their issues will be addressed, and that leads to further disadvantages of resource and literacy and so on down the spiral. And so what's striking to me about this digital divide context, when we're thinking about COVID-19, is that we know very well by now that elderly people are among the highest risk for serious illness or death from COVID-19. Right? Even before the pandemic, we had lots of evidence that elderly populations suffered from high rates of social isolation and loneliness, right? To the point that lots of researchers were, discussing the loneliness epidemic. And so what's striking to me is that what looks on the one hand like some of the most vulnerable segments of our society, the elderly, are the ones who are precisely the least likely to benefit from advances in these digital technologies. Right? So I've seen some data that suggests, back in 2016, the Pew Research Center showed that like 75% of people over 65 don't have reliable broadband connections. Right? So the idea is that if we think a principle of justice dictates that we ought to help those who are worst off first, these advances in digital health technologies, to me, it seems like anyway, there's a pretty substantial risk that rather than addressing those inequalities, they might make them even wider. So, to wrap up, what I've tried to suggest briefly here is that I think that the evidence for efficacy of various digital health apps, especially those on like smartphones and chatbots, is pretty weak. And I think that the likelihood is pretty high, in fact, that if many of these technologies were adopted at scale, they could serve to exacerbate many existing inequalities. And so I want to conclude by suggesting that I worry this very same dynamic is in play with lots of other technology fixes that have been proposed as a response to COVID-19. And not only those related to health, but also those related to finance, education, shopping, and transportation, where we need to be asking the questions, or at least so I suggest, does this technology work? Does it improve the actual outcomes we're interested in? And if we were to adopt it, is it likely to help open or close the gap between the sort of digital haves and have-nots? So I will stop there and look forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much, Gus. That was great. I've been doing a lot of the talking so far. Sophie, did you want to lead off with a question, maybe from the chat or of your own? And I'll just remind everyone that if you want to type your questions into the chat, that's where we'll be looking for sources of the next part of the discussion. And I've seen a few already there, but I'll hand it to you, Sophie, for the first one this time.
Yeah, and I do want to ask the questions from the chat, but I have one for all of you, and maybe Gus first to start. And it is also related to the class because we met with the teaching team this morning, and I heard that in a lot of the seminars last week, there was discussion of responders because last week our guests were talking about social inequalities and COVID and inclusion in COVID, and responders came out. And so I know that there's a lot of students in the class that have strong opinions on COVID, and I think they'll be curious to hear what the panel is thinking about it, and in particular, Gus, to start, because you mentioned that what you talked about with mental health and apps, you can see it, like the discussion going into other areas, including online shopping, which I do a lot, and education. And I think respondus is on a lot of people's minds. So yeah, if the panel would like to talk about this would be great.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I'm happy to start. And I think that, I hadn't considered the example of respondus, but it seems like totally like a prime case where the first thing we'd want to know is like, what is the evidence that it actually decreases cheating? Right. And what I suspect happens is that it's like proprietary data that's not allowed to be shared, that people can't easily access. And even if they could, they couldn't fairly evaluate it. And so, to me, it's like, I totally agree that like the issues with privacy are huge and that we have to pay attention to student privacy. But to me, the more fundamental question is like, does it even work? Because if it doesn't work, then we should just reject it on those grounds. Right? Like, who cares about informed consent or privacy if it doesn't work? If it doesn't work, then we don't have a reason to use it. So, I don't know, like maybe that research has been done and maybe there is evidence that, Respondus does decrease cheating, just color me skeptical of that.
Rozita and Eric, I don't know if you have some thoughts on this. And I think Gus, you're so right that that's the first question to even start with.
Yeah, I can chime in here. So I will say that I do not use respondents in the courses that I teach. And for me, that boils down to 3 reasons, 2 of which I can remember off the top of my head. So the first is, of course, the ethical issues involved in essentially what is an invasion of students' privacy. The second one is because I don't think it works at a technical level, which may be different from the kind of work or effectiveness that Gus is talking about here, but even at a very nitty-gritty kind of technical level, like the amount of errors that I've just heard pop up with this software just make it seem like it's not even, maybe it works in some cases, but there's just so many cases in which, the software catches a movement that really has no meaning with cheating, that it just doesn't seem like it's a workable approach to this. I think if it's, the third reason, which I've just remembered, is that I think, we could debate about pedagogy, but I don't think it's necessarily the best pedagogical tool either, or a reflection of pedagogy. So, I think at the end of the day, I don't think it is worth the kind of stress that it puts on students and on instructors to figure it all out.
Thank you, Eric, and thank you, Ryan, for clarifying in the chat what Respondus is. It didn't occur to me because I'm just so interested in this. Rozita, so in terms of data privacy, because Respondus, there's, as I understand it, there's 2 things. There's the locking of the computer, but then there's the camera. You can actually use only one of them. I know a course in my department that only locks the computer, does not use the camera. But I haven't heard a whole lot of instances of that. And we see in other universities, this is not just at Guelph. There's been a lot of debates on this.
Sure. So I hate to say this. I worked at the Information Privacy Commissioner's Office as Information and Technology Officer, but I have to say I use Respondus. And I think I'm not sure I think to some extent it works for me. But I think more on the student side, at least they know that they have to, there's something that, it comes with the technology that, first of all, their computer is locked, not in all the cases. Some of my international, some of my students who are still in their own country, I don't know if it is a connectivity issue or what the issue is. For them, it doesn't work, and the camera doesn't work sometimes, so there is a glitch over there. But I think, first of all, let's go back to Canadian legislation. Under Canadian legislation, especially Ontario, because University of is under that jurisdiction. Sorry, give me a second. Sorry.
We actually talked about this. Was it last week? We were saying the unique challenges of running things from
sorry,
there was noise in the.
Yeah, no problem.
No worries, Rozita. We've all gone through it.
Every week I expect a little one to come in.
Yeah, sorry.
I've had my daughter, as I chair a department meeting, come in with an emergency, which was approving, this is relevant for this class, approving an app on her phone, right? I have control, and I'm just like, I'm chairing a department meeting here. She's like, but it's an emergency.
Always. Sorry, I all of a sudden got distracted. So anyway, under FIPA, our students are covered in a sense that if they come to University of Guelph and they ask how their data is being used, we have to be very transparent with them. They have the right to collect their own data. So we have legislation that unlike many other countries, for example, US, they don't have a comprehensive law that protects their citizens. In Canada, we have two of them. One is Government of Canada. We have Privacy Act that will mandate how citizen data is used. We also have PEPEDA that support, protects consumers. Each of the provinces, they have their own policies and laws for protecting citizens within that province. I think our legislation is quite people argue that it's not compared to some in EU, but I think our citizens are protected. And so I'm not, I have been using it. Has it been the best tool? Of course not, but at this point of time, because I wanted to have exam and I thought that it was important as a component how I evaluate the students. Students have been using, I have used both just the lockdown with and without camera. For students who had good connectivity, it worked. For students who didn't, I have to find another solution. But again, I think under privacy law, students are protected. And this is one issue to consider, but also I think we have to keep in mind we are on many apps that we have, and as we are browsing online, our data is being collected constantly, and it's all about how it's being used and how long our data is kept. Retention is important. And I think we have to consider all of those, that we are constantly under surveillance. At least I think the data with respondents and at University of Guelph, they are in good hands. So that's my only comment. But whether it's the best tool or not, of course not, but that's the only option we have right now.
Yeah, I think this is
Thank you so much.
a sort of a discussion that's likely to continue in the academic sector, and certainly here at the university, because we're all kind of learning about what works and what doesn't work. And one of the things, just as a small sidetrack here, is one of the things I've realized, Sophie probably sees the same as a fellow department chair, is there's a lot of processes we use that are paper-based or are based on in-person kinds of mechanisms of signing forms or submitting receipts or whatever it is. And the immediate kind of solution to that has been to just digitize that. So PDFs and scans of receipts and all that. And that actually is far less efficient than just signing a paper form or whatever. So there's like this sort of hybrid model of taking a paper process and doing it digitally. And I think in some ways, the need to have a written exam that we do on camera with a lockdown and stuff is it's almost in a way an example of that, where we're used to a certain process and we got to figure out how to do this online. And I'm quite interested in seeing what other things may develop that are sort of truly online kinds of approaches. So it's going to be an interesting process to see how all of this shakes out as we continue to learn about, how to do the old ways that we used to do online and what new ones might come up. Your last comment, Rozita, segues very nicely into a question that I had, which was the difference in privacy concerns or data uses in the case of government collection versus the private sector. So we kind of talk about, in my mind, I have to remind myself to distinguish potentially between, what the COVID contact tracing app does or what a health app does that's put out by the province or by the federal government versus Amazon or Facebook or what have you. And I guess the question I have is are there significant differences in the kinds of data that are collected, the regulation of uses of those data, and the perception in terms of concern about privacy? Do people tend, at least in Canada, tend to be more nervous about the government collecting something than Facebook or Amazon or Microsoft? And does that vary from country to country? So I guess the contrast between public, government collection and private sector, and where those shake out in your view.
Okay, very good question, Ryan. So generally in Canada, and I think in under many other regulations, privacy is defined around personal data. It has it comes to effect if it is personal data or not. And so some specific data types, for example, name, email addresses, as things that makes us immediately identifiable. Those are considered personal data. Obviously, they're protected, but I will talk about protection in a few minutes. Also, what makes personal data concept very confusing for most people is some data is not personal data, but under certain circumstances, maybe the use of AI or modeling, then that individual becomes personally identifiable. Immediately that data, which could be your coat color, it could be your hair color, or something that's not considered personal data, immediately becomes personal data. And again, under that data is even protected. So so GDPR, General Data Protection in Europe. So they have a very similar definition, but they are the way they protect it is slightly different. They have strict laws around personal data. Canada does as well compared to many other countries, but they are not similar to Europe. So basically, whether the data should be protected under jurisdiction in Canada, it depends whether it's a personal data or not. So, so if our data is with the government, then again, as I mentioned, we have a very comprehensive law that protects data. But protecting data that doesn't mandate how it should be used. So sometimes, so usually based on privacy principles, what they say, you have an objective in mind, you have a purpose, and you collect data for that purpose. So when you collect the data for that purpose, then obviously you can use it for that purpose. So if Canadians, they don't feel comfortable how government is using their data, if that data collection is legitimate and it was for the purpose, data was collected for that purpose, I assume they can't do anything because that was the reason data was collected. But if the government of Canada or under PIPEDA, which is, is the law that protects consumers, if the organization claims that they use data for a specific purpose, but they use it for other purposes, then that is something that they're doing illegal, and then it can be, we can basically hold them accountable and ask why they're processing our data for a purpose that they haven't specified. Do we know for what purpose they're using our data? We don't know, so that's a hard one to track. I think with government, they have to be. I assume they're way more protective because it's a government and they cannot misuse data. And if employees, for whatever is their intentional or unintentionally misuse the data, then they will be punished for that. For misusing data. So use is different from protection. Protection is around personal data. Use really goes back to the original intention as for why data was collected. And again, I think with the industry, I know we are not too worried about that. With companies and service providers, we have no way of tracking generally how our data is being used and whether it's being used for the purpose that we were told. I'm not sure, I'm not saying I 100% trust the government, but at least I think they know the legislation, they have been trained around it, and they know there are specific laws that are monitoring them, so.
I guess, so just as a really quick follow-up on accountability, the mechanisms that are in place, so there's legislation's important, but then we don't know if they're doing this or that. And then what happens if someone gets caught? I guess there's a question of how does one identify misuses? There was a story, I think not too long ago, about police use of COVID testing data of some description. I have to find the story again. So that comes out, and presumably there's a review, and police stop doing that, I guess, or something. But in many ways, it kind of ratchets things up, right? So it's hard to go. This has already been done. Maybe you can stop it, but each time there's a small erosion in this, in the privacy or in the trust in the use of data and stuff. And so, is there a difference between likelihood of misuse being identified in government use versus private sector, or in consequences, I guess? So if Facebook gets fined $100 million, that's not a huge thing to them necessarily, right?
Mhm. When there is a case that we get to know, for example, or if there is a glitch, a breach, or whatever, that we understand they weren't using the way they were supposed to. If it is a company, obviously Canadians have the right to go to their own. If it is company, they have to take their complaint to the Privacy Commissioner of Canada, and they look over, those sorts of things with industry. If it is related to the government and provincial, then you take it to the privacy commissioners, which provincial one. So they have lawyers, they look at the case by case basis, they evaluate that. You can get your own lawyer, but generally commissioners, as you know, commissioner's office, they are an independent kind of entity that would, although they are being paid by the government, but quote unquote, they don't work for the government. They are there to protect citizens. And so they look over the case, and it goes to court, and then case by case basis, it will get investigated. And so if the organization doesn't do their due diligence, if they don't comply with their own policies that, just assuming it was transparent, then they have to pay for it. And one thing that Canada lacks compared to, for example, GDPR, General Data Protection in Europe, they have very clear mandate over how much they have to pay, and not how much, but how they will be punished if they don't comply. In Canada, what they say, what's lacking, we have comprehensive policies and laws, but enforcement, we are very weak. But anyway, they have to either pay for the loss of maybe its reputation, financial, or whatever, they have to cover that. So basically that's how it works. Yeah.
Sophie, did you want to?
Yeah, thank you so much, Rozita. And I'm actually really enjoying reading the chat, particularly Nina and Cassandra are really interesting right now, I find. There's so many questions in the chat. And so I'm going to try to get to some of those because we haven't yet, even though, I have actually one before the chat. Sorry, I keep forgetting. So the second class we had Mark Lipton coming from the School of English and Theatre Studies. And one of the things he mentioned is facial recognition. And he talked about how cities have invested millions of dollars in facial recognition, which the masks are really putting into question. And so I don't know if one of you has some thoughts on this and how. So we've talked about data privacy, but there's ways in which this is maybe changing the sort of data we're collecting, I imagine, and that some of the data has become much more easier to collect. Other data linked to the face is a bit more challenging, right? I'm just guessing, so I don't know, and I haven't read anything about this. I don't know if there's something about it, and it was a comment made by Mark kind of in passing and we never picked it up, but I've been thinking about it ever since. So Eric and Rozita, some thoughts about the data and the types of data and how it changes, yes?
So I can start us off, and it's not going to be a direct answer, but it might actually get at both of the last questions. And so as a geographer, one of the particular kinds of data that I'm interested in, that is enmeshed in my discipline, is of course location data. So this is data about where you are, where something happened. It can be very precise. That is, we can, guess, or at least, predict down to, a meter or so where this thing happened, where you were, and it can be very accurate too. That is to say, we can actually know within, 3 or 4 or 5 meters where you really were when we grabbed your coordinates, okay? So that's location data. It can be accurate, it can be precise. And this is data that, is collected all the time. So visiting websites, it's the blue dot on your phone. It's, often stealthily collected on websites through cookies and trackers that are, have nothing to do with it, with the actual thing that you're really interested in on that website, but grab your location if you haven't enabled. take that and you know, often sell it for marketing and advertising purpose, because even if that location data doesn't have attributes like your name, so on and so forth, that is potentially identifying information, or it is at least enough to work with in order to target ads and so on and so forth. And so that's a huge issue, but I want to point out that, and so it's something that is very easy to collect and only has gotten easier to collect over the past 25 years since GPS was made public and, you know, as a military technology back in the 90s. But what I want to point out here is that even though that kind of data would be potentially theoretically very useful in a COVID tracking system or app, right? Where, you know, your location could be correlated with the location of somebody who is known to be infected. That data could be very important. Even though that is the case, that is not how the government of Canada has proceeded with its COVID alert app. Okay, so, you know, to get to these questions about accountability, I mean, I think the government realized, you know, collecting this kind of data opens up a lot of different issues. Maybe we shouldn't go there. Maybe we should pursue another technology, one that still has an awareness of where you are or your proximity, but not necessarily where in space on the surface of the Earth you actually were. So it's got that proximity component, but not location per se. And so, you know, we have a lot of technology. We're getting, technical advances, of course, are in development all the time. But, you know, that doesn't mean that we always choose to go down those paths for good reasons. And I think that's a good example of this.
Thank you. Rozita, you have some thoughts too?
Sure. So I thought maybe Gus wants to say something, but so location data, biometric, facial, images, they're extremely sensitive. Obviously, they are considered personal data. The use of those really depends, again, on the purpose. So the way we haven't been doing things, so I think a few times I've mentioned General Data Protection Regulation, GDPR. One thing that this legislation, I mean, this law has done, I mean, it's just many laws within law, you know, so within GDPR. But one thing it has done, it has kind of put emphasis on very fundamental concepts of privacy principles. Data minimization, why you are collecting, first of all, link the data collection to purpose, and also minimize the data that satisfies that purpose. So don't collect everything that comes close to you and just for the purpose of, you know, one very simple kind of application. I usually give the example of, you know, flashlight, that, you know, there was an app that was collecting location information for the flashlight. Obviously there was no connection. So why you are collecting that? So lots of thinking has to go through when somebody's developing those tools. And also there's lots of technology available, as just the example that was given by Eric. So there are privacy solutions that can de-identify data at source as much as possible. So obviously we have to think none of these technologies are 100% effective. So for example, for facial recognition, what's the purpose of collecting that data? Could only some biomarkers to be collected from the face if it is needed for certain type of application, instead of collecting the entire, you know, image. So, you know, so, and the location example that was given, that was a great one. Instead of collecting precise location, just, you know, region or some area. So there are many different ways that we can handle privacy and also ensure, we have to think about practicality, that we are collecting data for a purpose. And we have to also be very cognizant about privacy. So how could we bring these two side by side and make an app or a tool that is both efficient and also ensures privacy? I always believe technology is the easiest part. So we can develop something as technologists that it is privacy preserving, or, you know, so it can do what we want. It's just the designers and also excessive testing, making sure that it should work the way it should. So there is always a solution. But also we have to understand many of these organizations are hungry for data. So if they're not doing it, it could be because they don't have the resources. As you know, privacy and security is type of skills that are, we are still training. There aren't that many out there. And also these organizations are hungry for data. So it's, I think it's obligation of the government to hold them accountable, to put policies such as GDPR. I don't know if you've heard, Canada was thinking of having digital charter, which had 10 principles. It was the identification at source, data portability, and many others similar to GDPR. GDPR citizens are allowed to question organization on how their data is being used, and AI algorithm that is used, it has to be interpretable. That means they cannot use very sophisticated deep learning methods. That is like a black box, data goes in, you don't know how it gets processed and it comes out. It has to be very transparent and interpretable, which means the AI algorithm has to be overly simplified, which is sometimes problematic. But anyway, so at least some policies could be put in place to make sure that companies understand if they collect data and misuse it or use it for a different purpose, they will be punished. So technology absolutely can address privacy concerns. How, it's up to the designers, but also we need kind of enforcement from the government, and also training around ethical designs and being cognizant of ethical issues.
Thank you so much, Ryan. I think.
Yeah, so I'm actually, so I want to maybe think about a slightly different application of technology in relation to privacy, which is people, not a surveillance state, but very common practice of videotaping each other and ourselves, and either the ethics of that, or if you think about, for example, the number of videos that have been posted of conflicts over mask wearing, and or police violence, or documenting what's happening at protests and stuff, where people are, because they have a constant access to video equipment essentially in their phone, a large amount of the information that's out there on what's actually happening in terms of violent behavior and so on is because of people videotaping each other. And it's not the state, it's not a corporation, it's just you're there and you pull out your phone and you capture some really meaningful and impactful event, or it's another example of somebody fighting over masks. And so I wonder, thoughts on the sort of, I guess ethics or approach that we should be taking as a society to that development, where it's not being done by a government or a corporation. It's probably not regulated by legislation as straightforwardly as that, but it's a huge part of what's influencing social behavior right now. Any thoughts on I don't know what you'd call that, self-surveillance, I guess, or intra-societal surveillance or something?
Yeah, I mean, I think there can be no doubt that in the context of the Black Lives Matter movement in the US, the existence of video footage rather than sort of eyewitness testimony is decisive. Now, one of the things that I have been interested in since the rise of like deepfake technology, right? So the ability to sort of generate kind of ad hoc forms of speech and video and images, is that, so, for as long as video and audio technologies have been around, they play this role of like an epistemic backstop, right? So like when there's a debate about something, we can just say, well, the debate ends because like he was caught on video saying it, right? Mm-hmm. Or the evidence is decisive because we have an audio recording. And so one of the things that to me is frightening is how close it seems that off-the-shelf technology, right? So like not necessarily you have to have a PhD in machine learning or something to use, but like off-the-shelf technology is the kind of thing that can undermine precisely that evidence, right? That has proved to be so important in social justice movements and, arguably also in things like mask enforcement. It strikes me that a lot of these technologies are, relatively easily available off the shelf and will likely become increasingly, more available. And there you have to ask like really, really serious questions about like how those ought to be regulated, right? And to sort of riff on a point Rozita made earlier, you know, like these aren't problems that necessarily lend themselves to an obvious technical solution, right? So it's not obvious that the solution is to build better AI that can get even better at detecting the best deepfakes. And then you get in this kind of arms race, right, about who can produce the better deepfakes and who can produce the better deepfake protectors. Like at some point, it just ceases to be a technical issue, and then something like a sort of policy intervention is needed. And so that's just a nice example where like the technology is kind of the easy part, right? But sort of deliberating about what our values are and, you know, what it means to be living in an informed democracy or something, that's the hard part.
Difficult problem.
Technology is the easy part. That's a really good point that you've all made. Ryan, do you want? I was wondering. There's been a few questions for Eric on mapping.
Go ahead.
To that, I think the first one by Rachel, which is really interesting to me. Like when someone gets tested for COVID, do their results get counted for their address on from their address on their health card, or to the testing center where they went, and how does this affect the map? And then just throw in another one later on about like mapping and vaccines, and what's the role you can see once we have a vaccine of maps playing. And I think some of that is about like the kind of data we choose to use for a map, right? And how does that affect our story, and how does that affect the kind of ways in which we'll go on for for the vaccine?
Yeah, I think those are wonderful questions. So I'll start with the first, and I will be clear that I don't know the answer for 100% sure, but I think it's important to understand that there's a difference between the information that the public health department, the public health regions collect and work with and have access to, and the kinds of data that we, the general public, have access to and that we see on our maps, right? So if you go in and get tested and you know, are tested positive for COVID, you know, they might actually, and probably do, have your address, and, you know, they use that for contact tracing purposes and whatnot. That information, your address, will not then, you know, make it to the public facing side of things, right? Instead, that will be aggregated to the public health region boundary. So we will see that on the map there. So it's very possible that if you live in one public health region and go in and get tested in another one, that might change the results. But you know, I don't know how often that happens. But that is a really good question. In terms of the vaccines, I mean, I think that's the way you kind of worded the question, Sophie, is exactly right, and is the answer, which is that, you know, maps, we often like to think of them as the arbiters of truth, as like, well, we just need to make a map and get it over with, and it'll show us the answer to help us answer the questions we want, but that we have to know what we're asking of them. So we have to know, you know, what we want to be able to do and show with those maps. So if the goal is to distribute, you know, vaccines based on where, you know, hotspots are right now, or where, and we could think of all sorts of different criteria. It'd be a great thought exercise, like who should get a vaccine first, right? We have to answer that question before we can then figure out what the role of maps will be. But if, for instance, we say, well, areas where, you know, that with high rates or high populations of elderly individuals, like that, you know, we should focus on there, then, you know, if that's our answer, then yes, we can certainly use mapping and draw on census data to help us show, okay, these are the parts of the world, these are parts of the country where, you know, we need to make sure the vaccine gets to first. But again, it's more of a tool than, you know, something that'll just show us magically the answer.
And I think that's something that's coming up in a lot of this, is that technology itself isn't good or bad, to make it simplistic, but it's what how we use it, but also how we decide we're gonna, you know, collect the data and everything. So that's the part, that's the hard part. I'll let Ryan, I'll let you.
I had a quick follow-up maybe for Eric on that, and you know, I think one of the things we've seen is throughout some of these discussions is the challenge of getting information to to members of the public. And we've also seen various panelists say there's not one public, there's different audiences. And graphs and maps are a huge part of conveying a lot of that information, but also setting the narrative that's communicated. And I'm wondering if you have seen, as a geographer, when you watch the news or when you see these reports, do examples jump out at you of, wow, that's a really manipulative way of presenting that information on this map? Or do you see, if not nefarious, then common errors that you know are kind of changing the perception of people who don't know better when they look at a map? As a geographer, do you experience the reports in a way that might be different from the rest of us? I'm kind of curious about that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I have many examples of maps that I think, you know, for nefarious reasons or not, potentially mislead. Although I would say, you know, like any sort of text, maps, you know, make an argument. And so
right.
It's not necessarily, you know, a matter of misleading. It's just that you make a map and it wants to tell one particular story, one particular narrative, and maybe that's not the whole story. And so oftentimes when we see COVID maps in the news, we see maps that report raw numbers rather than caseloads, which can be very misleading. You know, all those sorts of examples. This was especially true earlier on in the pandemic, I think, in trying to make arguments or narratives around the US versus the rest of the world, that sort of thing. And so, I mean, this is certainly, you know, an issue. One of the things that I'm really interested in is how interactive mapping, so the kinds of maps that we see on web pages, actually help audiences better understand the data. So in a print map, in your, you know, old print newspaper, you know, you can't really interact with that data. Whatever's printed there is what you've got. Whereas in an interactive map, people can hover over things, click on things, drill down into the data a bit more to maybe get a bit more context to the data there. So, you know, that technology, these new web technologies potentially offer us the opportunity to contextualize some of this important data a bit more. And I think that's really the key, is more context.
Yeah, interactive maps are very satisfying.
You spend a lot of time.
Sejal just asked a question that I think is really interesting for all of you, and says that we've talked about how technology has helped us in the pandemic in this class and in the course in general, but how has technology made COVID worse? And that's something we haven't really talked about much in this course in general. So one example Sejal gives is, have people been abusing maps to downplay or upplay the pandemic to obtain control? The other thing I'm seeing up much higher up in the questions earlier on is linked to the digital divide, and if, you know, technology is inaccessible, or if there's less smartphone is in a population like the senior population in Canada, are they using the COVID tracking app as much? So what are the ways in which the technology has, I guess, like maybe like not helped and even made it worse?
I mean, maybe I can just offer a you know, personal anecdote here. Like, one way that technology's objectively made my life worse is the kind of further blurring of like the work-life boundary, right? And so it seems absolutely necessary and the right thing to do. You know, we do this class remotely, of course. But yeah, just the question of, you know, when socialization with friends and family happens on the exact same platforms as like this part of our job that we're doing right now, right? Like, I'll probably get on a Zoom call with friends later. I sort of worry about the psychological effects of that, because, you know, even, I mean, for 10 or 15 years now, right, people have been sort of raising alarms about the kind of always on culture and sort of, you know, always being forced to respond to notifications and the kind of pressures at work for people who, are the types who respond to email at 3 in the morning are the ones who get promotions. And it seems like if there was, at least in many professions, somewhat of a boundary, like now, that just seems like it's been washed away, and that's sort of been reflected in my day-to-day, at least.
Yeah, absolutely. No question about it. Any other, Eric or Rozita, did you have examples too on anything you wanted to mention on that question? It's a very interesting question.
I'm just going to share in the chat here, example, just to circle back to the question of, are poorly designed maps or maps made nefariously for certain ends. It's a great example here of a map that looks totally neutral, like nobody's doing anything nefarious about it, but it's clearly been manipulated in order to show that COVID isn't or wasn't as bad in this one particular US state at the time. So we certainly see these kinds of things cropping up.
Yeah.
Yeah, so for me, I think the example I would give is, first of all, mental health, as Gus mentioned, it's an absolutely big issue. But also, I'm a bit concerned about some of these tools that are being developed kind of for distance monitoring of employees. The issue of privacy, they are becoming extremely sophisticated. In terms of evaluation of employees, so all of those, how we have to revisit everything that we used to do, all our workflows, processes, social values much earlier than, so I used to teach ethics course in computer science, and I always thought about, okay, maybe in few years, in 10 years or something like that, we start looking adoption of artificial intelligence technologies. With COVID, all those trends have been expedited, and I don't think we are ready. We have the capacity to even digest that and think about all the side effect of adopting technology so immediately. And isolation would be one of them, low quality education if we continue being online, and many, I mean, I just cannot think of all of them. So I don't know, can we immediately think about our policies, procedures, social values, and all of that and change those? I don't know. I think it's, we have worked many years to just get where we were with all of those. Now we have to immediately shift and start thinking differently. I think it would be tough, but anyway, we will see what happens. If we go back to normal and can gradually be on the same path that we used to be, to just digest and understand and change, I don't know, but we will see.
So I guess a question I might have, and you mentioned at various times it's been mentioned about AI and machine learning and automation, large-scale data collection, and so on. And I suppose the question I would have is it inevitable that all of that is going to happen increasingly? So what we're talking about is kind of how to manage it, not stop it per se. And my question might be, is it even more inevitable if that's a combination of words you can actually use? But like it was very, very likely before, and now the pandemic is just, that's it. Like we are now not going to be able to stop it even if we wanted to. Do you have a sense in the field that is the trajectory, and what we're dealing with is how to handle it? Or could it be scaled back, I guess is the question. Point of no return been crossed or not?
I doubt that we will go back, to be honest with you. I think because the price of storage is coming down, computation processing is coming down. And I think in some way, so I don't want to generalize it, but in many sectors, it's more beneficial to have artificial intelligence or machine learning as replacing employees, because some of the jobs, you just repeat the same thing. So obviously machines would be more accurate if they have been developed and designed properly. So we are going on that direction. So it's absolutely critical to govern it, manage it, so, and then, so one thing that scares me about artificial intelligence, we used to have discussions many years ago about would artificial intelligence become completely, I mean, end-to-end sufficient and be independent and autonomous. I used to say no, it's a long way. What with generative models that now, even artificial intelligence is generating data. So that scares me because they kind of generate their own data and they can analyze it. And, you know, lots of hacking is shifting to machine learning. So the hackers hack the data, the algorithm, the parameters in the algorithm, the outcome of the algorithm. So I think we are constantly, I know I mentioned technology is the easy part, but it's constantly evolving and we have to catch up with all these challenges. I believe we are going on that direction. First of all, from social and perspective, values, and all of that, we have to revisit the legislation. We have to revisit governance methodology, practices, policies, protocols. Those have to be new ones, have to be generated. We have to educate our citizens to have the knowledge, digital literacy, to be able to find jobs, work with those tools, elderlies, children. So I think we have the capacity. I'm not saying it's not going to happen, but it definitely will change lots of things. But we are definitely on that direction. And with the trend that technology is going in terms of processing, hardware, processing, storage, and algorithms that are becoming more and more sophisticated, then I don't think there is an end to it.
Gus, did you want to say something too?
Yeah, I mean, I would totally agree. And so I saw in the chat, a few people were mentioning Shoshana Zuboff's surveillance capitalism and that kind of context. And, one of the things that she points out in that book, and like many other scholars have pointed out too, is that there was lots of ways in which September 11th was kind of this decisive moment for tech, and that the sort of massive collection of data could be justified on the grounds of national security. And at least in the US, like just billions and billions of dollars of government funding went into various kind of private sector tech companies, startups, doing any kind of research that could be justified as like surveillance or national security and preventing terrorist attacks. And I'm a philosopher, so I feel like I have license to speculate, baselessly about these things. But I do suspect that, like, when the history is written, we'll think about COVID in the same way, that it sort of gave license in a lot of ways for this sort of like really, really thoroughgoing datafication. And I want to say, like, especially in the health sector, especially in education, and especially in transportation, like these are three that stand out to me as just like going to be fundamentally shifted by the pandemic. And the dynamic is a familiar one, right? That in times of crisis, emergency measures are passed through, and then they just had this inertia about them, that it was just like, unthinkable in 2001 that we would allow a private company to map, in Google, like street view of like, private residential neighborhoods in parts of Europe. And, the strategy has been largely effective, that the litigation gets dragged out in court. And by the time any decision could be reached, people are saying, oh, I just couldn't imagine life without it. And we're going to say the same thing, right? And I couldn't imagine actually having to go to the doctor's office. I couldn't imagine life without telehealth. I couldn't imagine, not on-demand public transportation. And I think that's sort of my prediction about how that dynamic is likely to play out.
Sophie, did you want to go?
Yeah, that was so interesting.
Yeah, I'm just like still processing, but yeah.
About this. There was a question earlier on from Maggie, who's interested to hear about privacy measures or governance that exist as it relates to large populations of children, so minors that are now participating in online learning. And I would add to that, because it's not just online learning. We've had our kids at home for months at some point, and we had to work, and my daughter basically raised herself for a while and used a lot of YouTube for that. And it's been interesting to see the journey she's taken by herself on that. But yeah, so I think that kind of like, I do worry sometimes about, of course, like the kind of things she sees, but also the kind of ways in which, right, like, so privacy around the minors that are more than ever, I think, on the web.
Yeah, absolutely. So Well, okay, that's a tough one, at least for me, because obviously I'm not a lawyer, but so I think the way, obviously privacy, the children's data is also protected. Obviously, we have a very strict kind of policy around the use of personal data in general, especially for minors. With the advancement of these technologies, I think they also have certain policies that, for example, I think many of the educational platforms in Ontario, they have moved to Google. So I have been trying to figure out what policies they have or how they collect data from my son, for example. I know they don't track, for example, kids, how they search the web. They have certain protection around that, so there is no collection of cookies or, kind of children browsing data, browsing behavior. So I think this is something that I have seen a lot in discussion, and so government is paying attention to the concerns and also breaches that happen. But generally speaking, I think many of these platforms that are working with schools, and they are very cognizant about that and the type of data that gets collected from the students, and the identification and anonymization as much as possible, not selling the data, keeping complying with retention policies and all of that. But also there are platforms that are being created, such as Discord, that kids can create their own account, they can create their own social network. So if it is associated with an educational institution that is kind of well established, maybe it's associated with the government or not, they're usually very cognizant about children's data and how they use and process it. But if it is, obviously there are many online tools that are being created that would allow children to create their own social network, and they kind of create their own community. So it's important to educate kids around, not downloading any tools that are online, asking for permission, kind of associating, going through the steps with your kids and those sort of things. But I don't worry too much about school data that is, schools that collect data, or maybe some online kind of lessons that are associated again with an organization. But obviously we have to monitor the kids, because the number of these type of tools that they have, they don't require parent supervision, is increasing.
Thank you.
Are there positives that may result down the line from kids basically being required to become internet literate? If you do several months of your classes in Zoom, and you're getting your homework through email, and is that likely to spawn any kind of difference in where they would be in their literacy or comfort with technology that wouldn't have been true if they had just been potentially very infrequently using those technologies?
Again, I'm not the expert in this area, but definitely, I personally, I'm very much in favor of allowing kids to get to know some of these tools. And I think there is a learning. I know schools, they used to have lots of sessions, bringing police or other people to talk about privacy, giving some examples around kind of online bullying, all those sort of things, reading privacy policies, what's important when you read the privacy policy, what you should look at, what you should, what should you be concerned about, and what you should pay attention to. But I think it's absolutely important to talk to kids, talk about kind of how these systems work. First of all, they collect data. I think they understand what data is, maybe as early as maybe they're 7 or 6. I mean, some of them are quite smart. Talk about data collection, some examples of, for example, police, your IP address of your computer is being collected, and police can locate you, and, those sort of things, and make them aware of data and collection and privacy, and allow them to get used to these tools. I'm not a huge fan of not allowing them and, just protecting them too much. But to be honest with you, one of the challenges that we are having, and I think many parents are having the kids constantly behind the computer, it just distracts them constantly. How we can get away from that, how we can address it, that's the main challenge. To me, it's more than privacy, because again, many of the tools I allow my son to download and use, I know them. But the time that he spends online and how much and what he visits, and, you know, making him understand what the boundaries are, for me, it's much more of a challenge.
Yeah. Gus?
Yeah, I mean, I guess there could be some positives, right? But there's a wealth of tons of correlational evidence, and a smaller but not insignificant amount of more like experimental evidence that when like teenagers do spend more time online, there's higher rates of depression and anxiety. And so like Jean Twenge's book, iGen, was like, you know, put this on the map in a lot of ways in like 2010 or 12 and showed, you know, the rates of anxiety and depression skyrocketed around the times that like iPhones became commercially available and widely used. And again, that was all correlational data, but there have been, you know, some randomized studies that sort of have shown these connections. And I don't know. I mean, the question that you always want to ask is like, so who's benefiting, right? And so it's like obvious in the cases where when we go massively online and then all of a sudden school districts adopt Google Classroom, like Google stands to benefit. Is the kids like, you know, small advances in digital literacy going to be balanced off by what I think are some like pretty predictable mental health effects? Like I think that can be hard to justify. So that's an area where I'm not super optimistic, I would say.
Very fair point.
So I think one issue we're having with these technologies with schools, basically students have no options. I think all, you know, Ontario schools, they moved to Google, and there were extensive discussion with the Office of Privacy Commissioner around what they can and they can't do with the data. I agree that it's all about collecting more data for Google, but our kids have no option, but at least they have become, to a great extent, cognizant about privacy. How they use that data, I have no idea. I mean, it's just, I don't know what they have discussed, where the data reside, whether it's in Canada, whether it's under privacy, Canadian privacy, you know, so lots of things to think about. But obviously mental health, obviously, I completely agree. It's a major challenge with teenagers, and addiction to games and online, you know, kind of browsing and those kind of things. Yeah.
I would just weigh in very quickly to say that I agree with everything that's been said. I would add that my particular worry is that, okay, this is the new normal and we're just catching up, right? So it's wonderful that our kids are now, you know, gaining important data literacy skills about what data is, cookies, you know, how information is tracked on the internet, that sort of thing. That's still very important in today's world, but, you know, ideally it would have been skills that we would have picked up, you know, a decade ago, right? And so there's always more new technologies, right, to become immersed in. And I'm not sure if like learning through Zoom every day and getting to know
right
is really, you know, going to be the same. You know, it's just like, that's the new normal. You have to know it.
Good point.
Yeah, we could talk about this for so long, right? Because so much has changed for me. Even I can see, right, of course, our socialization, because a lot of the kind of community socialization is really disturbed. And so all of a sudden, friends that were in a distance or family that were at a distance, there's no difference between them. And then I find that, yeah, like some of the friendships work better with chat or with like on camera than others. And so it's been really interesting to see these shifts. And then, yeah, to see, you know, our children and how, I mean, in a sense, it's hard to judge my daughter and how much she's on the tablet, because I'm on the tablet quite a lot too, right? And so it's been interesting to also see, I just pick up the computer and start to work without mentioning I'm working, right? Like I just kind of assume that's what I'm doing. And because after months of having a kid there while I worked, I just work all the time. So I think we'll have to adjust, and that takes a while. I wonder, Ryan, because Maggie asked a question for Gus, and it's a question we've asked our guests from time to time, right? Like, in the past 8 months of the pandemic, what are the things that have surprised you from the perspective of your own work, and things that you would have predicted knowing what you know, and the things that you are kind of surprised? And the question Maggie had for Gus is like, are there any theories or ideas in your research that you've changed your mind about in the past 8 months? I can tell you, like, not like, well, I mean, historically, for sure, there's a lot of things, but I think for me, one of the things I've come to think is that it's gonna take me so long to fully absorb, even up till now, all that has come and all that has happened and all that I've learned about myself and about others and about the world. It's just gonna take a really long time to process it. And so that for me, so I think it's just overwhelming. I think the kind of learning I've done, some of it has been really challenging. It's been a pretty wild ride. Yeah, and personally, research, teaching, administration, on everything. But I don't know if some of our guests have some thoughts on that.
I mean, I guess like it's not really related to my research, but one of the things that I suspect if we asked people, you know, in like March or April, how universities would respond to this, you know, there's this stereotype of, you know, especially public universities being these like massive, bumbling, incompetent bureaucracies that, you know, can't get anything done because they move too slowly, and, you know, a bunch of like ivory tower academics. And, you know, like I don't want to like toot the horn of like our profession, but like in a lot of ways, I've been really surprised by how quickly and effectively a lot of universities have adapted. And so like one of the things that I've been following, you know, in the US is that there's, I mean, I you know, don't quote me on these numbers, but it was, if you sort of just like read the New York Times headlines, you would think, oh my God, so many of the cases, you know, are at universities, and it's just driving all these hospitalizations and stuff. Well, and in fact, it's about like 25% of universities are accounting for over 3/4 of the caseload, right? And so the vast majority of institutions are like adapting and doing things like relatively safely and effectively. So I think like I would have been very cynical about higher education and like the university system being able to effectively adapt to a pandemic. And I've been like pleasantly surprised, I think. By that in a way that I would have been much more cynical months ago. Then now I look back and I just think like, yeah, I mean, it's not great, but like given the situation, it's also not that bad. Like not as bad as I would have thought, I think.
Yeah, that's a good point. And I think it is surprising. In my department, by and large, instructors are actually happy with their courses and how they're going. It's just really, if you're thinking about it, very, very surprising. Rozita, Eric, things that have surprised you or things that you've expected given your research and your expertise?
Not my research, but I have just, my sister lives in England, and she was saying that even the people that she knew in IT who have lost their jobs, and they had different type of job for the last 10 years, they have all found new IT jobs just recently, just because the demand for people with expertise in IT, you know, programming or whatever, just any type, have significantly increased. And I think that's the same trend in Canada. So it's one of the type of jobs that is growing, unlike many others. So they're very much in demand. Our students, the ones that couldn't find co-ops this semester, they just disappeared. They don't exist, and which is I'm not sure if I can, it's great, but anyway, it's just amazing. So when it first happened, I had many colleagues who work in industry, Google, Thomson Reuters, they were worried they would lose their jobs. Now they just cannot handle the amount of job that they, you know, just going, that they, you know, request or projects that they have. And they want to hire data scientists or people with expertise, privacy, security, data science, and they cannot, you know, kind of just fill in the positions. So I wasn't expecting that coming. I was thinking, I was expecting that many of these IT businesses would shrink. But there are many job sectors that are just growing, and IT is one of them.
Eric?
So I guess I've got a not work-related, well, maybe kind of work-related example, and then a more research-related example. And so the not work-related example is, well, I guess it is work-related. Okay, I'm just not even going to bother with that. You know, I've just been, I guess, surprised by how people have come together during the pandemic and my interactions with them through teaching or through research or through other kinds of things I'm doing. So, you know, you could certainly imagine maybe many of us did early on in the pandemic that everybody would just sort of retreat into their own hole and try to hide it, you know, shelter it out for the long haul. And in fact, I've just been so impressed by how, you know, you know, this isn't something I got exposure to teaching in person as much, but, you know, when I do Zoom teaching with students, you know, everybody's up in the chat, like helping each other out. And,
So
you know, it's just
fun.
amazing to see, and not necessarily something I'd actually thought about before I started teaching this way this fall. And so I've just been really impressed with that. And, you know, I've been involved in other kinds of research that has involved people collaborating and getting on Zoom calls once or twice a week. And, you know, I know it's exhausting, but I'm just, you know, people are willing to do it, and I think hungry for those kinds of connections. Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. I think I will actually miss the chat when we go back in person, because I find, I mean, the challenge is that the content in my other course, it just like I cannot get into much, like basically I can only get through 60% of the content because there's so many questions. But I'm just thinking it's just great to see that level of engagement.
There are definitely some surprising and interesting cases where being forced to work remotely actually does bring previously separated kind of people together in some way. And, you know, this course is an example of that.
Yes.
Where we've got people from all across campus. And you know, in person, would we have thought to try this? Would we have had alumni, for example, from across the country? You know, and so I think there's all those interesting positive side effects that do come from this. The ease of collaboration, you know, internationally, for example, is different. It's easier to do it. So yeah, there's some really interesting kind of positive side effects, or what I would have considered unanticipated, that hopefully we kind of keep. Actually, there's a few things I'm hoping that stick around after. Maybe an online office hours with chat is something a lot of us will continue doing. You know, there's various things like that I think we've discovered that it's just so disruptive that anything kind of goes right now, and we're trying stuff we wouldn't have tried and finding things we like. And, you know, of course, like this is one example, but there's lots of others. So yeah, it's kind of interesting to see how this all turns out, and what the new normal retains from this whole experience will be interesting too. So I do see we're at pretty much time.
Yeah.
As always happens, we could carry on and dive into other topics. I still had a few questions, but we'll have to save it there. We wanted to, I think, Colin, do you have some slides for the last little bit?
Yes, it's always our usual slide for, well, we'll first announce next week. So November 10, we have Pandemics in History and the Arts next week. And we've got Margot Irvine, who does French literature, who's coming from the School of Language and Literature. John Walsh does classics. And Elisa Woods is in music in the School of Fine Arts and Music. So it should be an interesting combination. And yeah, we'll see you next week. And we want to really thank our guests again. Eric, Rozita, and Gus. This was awesome. And as usual, we never quite know what to expect from our evening. This was amazing. So thank you so much. And thank you so much, everyone in the chat, as usual, because it just really makes the class. That's just, as I said, I'll miss chat when we go back to the...
You can keep using it. You'll find a way, I'm sure of it.
I think so. I really like it. So yeah, thank you so much, everyone in the audience, and thank you to our guests.
Thank you very much.
Brian, I'll let you close.
Just again, thank you, everyone. Very interesting. And I'm just always struck by the the common themes that come up, and yet the really diverse perspectives that always have something new to offer. And the same thing happened again tonight. So thank you very much for taking your time and sharing your expertise. I hope everyone else enjoyed the discussion as well, and we'll see you next week.
Yeah, well, a lot of thank yous in the chat. So yeah, thank you.
Oh yes, yeah.
Good week.
Good night, everybody. Cheers. Bye-bye.